All right, welcome, Dr. Anderson. Thank you so much for coming today. If you could give us the university and college you teach and also an explanation of your field, that would be great.
Sure. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Psychiatry, and my lab is at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And my expertise is in forebrain development in relation to schizophrenia and autism mostly. And my lab uses transgenic mice and mouse and human stem cells to study brain development in relation to neuropsychiatric illness.
That's great. So how long have you been a professor?
Let's see, I was an assistant professor at Cornell Medical College in 2001. And before that, I was an assistant professor at UCSF for 3 years with a kind of a career development award that's not fully independent, but I was an independent professor at Cornell in 2001. And then I rose to full professor there. I moved to Penn in 2011.
Great, wonderful. That's a long pathway. All right, so let's get into the main question I have here is like about your research. So can you tell us if you have done any research in the past or anything you're going to do for your future, and also if there are any data or latest findings in your lab?
Sure, I've been doing research since college. I got interested in schizophrenia when I was in high school. A friend of mine got sick, and he kind of disappeared from our friend group. And later on, we found out he actually suicided. And a little later after that, I found out a little bit more about why, and about how, what his sickness was like for him. Because it wasn't very obvious to the friend group. He just seemed really uncomfortable, but he didn't share with us what was going on in his head, which I think is true for a lot of kids, and teenagers that are starting to experience strange things, voices in their head and things. And they're not stupid. They know other people aren't hearing voices, and they tend to want to isolate themselves, and he didn't make it. But it got me interested in why that could happen to somebody who seems normal, and then they start getting really sick in this way, and hearing voices and having very strange thoughts. And so I went to college to major in neuroscience and psychology, and started doing research related to schizophrenia, in the early 1980s at Amherst College. And I've never stopped. I've been doing research related to schizophrenia for that long.
Wow, wonderful. I'm so sorry to hear that. It's great. I mean, it's wonderful that you're doing something out of I mean, it's I don't even know what to say or to begin with. So can you give us like a base of what schizophrenia is?
Sure. So people with schizophrenia, it's a word that describes not one illness. It's kind of it's a word that is used to describe a spectrum of symptoms. And for psychiatrists, there's a handbook that says, okay, these are the criteria that you would use to say, okay, someone has something like, say, schizophrenia. But it has kind of a checklist. Like it says, oh, you need to have like 5 of these 8 characteristics, and then you need to have 3 of these 6 characteristics. And so it's important to understand it's not one thing, and people can be given that diagnosis, or other people might call it a label, even though they are very different from each other, and they have different manifestations of the illness. So it's not like a disease like, say, Alzheimer's or Huntington's disease or something where most people are pretty similar to each other. It's a little more messy or complicated. It's partly because we don't understand in a detailed way how the brain works, especially when it comes to ways that people think. Um, but people with schizophrenia generally have um, auditory hallucinations, so they hear voices, and the voices sound to them like voices. They sound like my voice or your voice. And in fact, when studies have been done where you look and see where the brain is active during a particular um, you know cognitive task or a process or thinking, and they ask people with schizophrenia to press a button whenever they hear a voice. And when they do that, they find that their auditory cortex, the part of the brain that's normally active when they're hearing outside sounds, is active when they hear a voice. And that makes perfect sense based on what they tell you, because they tell you it sounds like a voice, and that part of the brain is acting as if it's hearing a voice, even though nothing's coming from the ear, and so that's one symptom that most people with schizophrenia have, but not everyone. Most people have some kind of a disconnection from reality, where it isn't all reality. Like they might understand 99% of reality, but at the same time, they will tend to have some sense of something they believe very strongly in that the rest of us don't appreciate. We don't see it. And so those are called delusions. And usually the delusions are kind of negative, kind of scary. So people with bipolar disorder, that sometimes people say manic depression, they'll have delusions of grandeur. They'll think they're like the greatest stock investor ever and spend all their money in one weekend investing on stocks that they think are the best ones. And at that moment, they're sure that's going to hit. People with schizophrenia tend to have more scary, paranoid kind of delusions where they think they're part of a plot of some sort. And it can vary greatly across different cultures. A lot of times it takes religious themes, and it depends on the culture you're in, on how exactly that plays out. For example, in Christian cultures, it's not uncommon for people to feel like they're at the middle of a fulcrum between God and the devil, and they can hear voices of angels and the devil fighting each other in their head. It might be because they can hear the voices and they're trying to explain them. They don't make sense. And again, they're not stupid. They're just trying to make sense of it. And they're thinking, okay, well, what could this be? I've known people who would say they're sure they can hear submarines speaking to each other off the coast of California when I was working at UCSF in the 90s. At that time, there were things in the paper about submarines using very low frequency communications to talk to each other, American submarines, in some kind of experiment, and it was freaking out the whales. And so it was in the newspaper because the whales were clearly acting strangely, and people figured out it was because these submarines were doing these ultra low frequency communications. But somebody I knew in the clinic there at UCSF, or actually at the VA, was concerned that there were he could hear those communications. So he was hearing voices, but he was trying to figure out a reason for them. And it sounds, quote, crazy, but for the person who's experienced them, he's trying to figure out what would make sense, and it kind of made sense. Okay, in the paper that the Navy is conducting these experiments, I mean, he must be part of one of them. So people will often find something that, when you think about it, is fairly rational, given how weird their input is to their mind, but is completely irrational to the rest of us. So we label it a delusion, something that's out of touch with reality. So most people with schizophrenia experience that as well. A lot of people also experience what's called negative symptoms, where their mind has a very hard time doing things called working memory tasks. So working memory is where you have to hold one thought in mind while you're doing something else. And so the simplest example of that is just finishing a sentence. Usually when we start a sentence, we kind of know what we're going to say. Then we listen to what we're saying. We see whether we hear whether we said what we meant to say. And that requires having a plan and then listening to what's happening and seeing until you executed that plan or not. And so working memory is a very fundamental way in which we think. It allows us to maintain context with our stream of consciousness. If we don't have working memory, we wouldn't know from one moment to the next where we were or where we're going. And so people with schizophrenia have a hard time with this kind of task. Most of them will know where they are and where they're going, but they can have a really hard time doing what we would most people who don't have schizophrenia would consider very simple tasks in terms of thinking about one thing while you're doing something else. It could be just finishing a sentence. And when people are pretty sick with schizophrenia, they'll sometimes have what's called tangential speech, where they'll start talking to you, they get to the end of the sentence, and they can't remember what they were talking about. So they hear the last few words, and then they'll guess based on the last few words what they were talking about, and they'll take off based on the last few words into the next sentence, and then they'll do that again with the next sentence and the next sentence. And so you listen to them, and it bounces all around, and it's called tangential speech. A lot of times, if you can listen carefully enough, they are trying to tell you something, but sometimes they lose track of what they were trying to do. So I knew someone once who was, he was on a medication, difficult medication for people with treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and he was talking about a golf ball that hit his arm. And it didn't make sense because he was not golfing. He's in New York City, and is trying to listen to him, and he was saying, oh, he has a golf ball that hit his arm. And then he started talking about arms, and then he started talking about something about the New York Yankees because they had one of their pitchers whose arm was having trouble. And then he kind of went on in a totally different direction. Then I kind of went back to the arm, and I examined his arm, and sure enough, he had a golf ball sized lump in his arm where we'd drawn blood from him, and there'd been a bleed there, and it hadn't gotten infected, thankfully, but there was a golf ball in his arm. It made perfect sense what he was trying to say. He just couldn't say it in a way like a straightforward way. He lost his track and they went off into some other direction. This is what people with schizophrenia kind of live with.
I see. So does this have a connection with prefrontal cortex activation?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that's really important for these kind of working memory tasks. And people with schizophrenia have a hard time activating, but especially synchronizing activity in that part of the brain. So sometimes that part of the brain can be very active, but not in an organized way. The neurons need to fire in a sort of organized way, kind of like a symphony. If they all play at the same time, they might have a lot of activity, but it's just noise.
So is there a neural activity different between the person with schizophrenia and someone like a normal person? Like the way, how do I put this? Like the connections to the brain that communicates on what we're going to say. Like what is different in each?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's certainly an area of very active research about what is different. And I think, every scientist would have some different opinion about maybe, or there may be groups of scientists that think one thing and groups of scientists think something else. And part of it depends on, as I said, it's a heterogeneous disorder. So not everybody who has the disorder has the same kind of problem in terms of the pathology in the brain. From my perspective, the evidence most strongly suggests that the problem is one of essentially of disconnectivity. So when we're in adolescence, especially early in adolescence, between the ages of say like 12 and 15 or 16, we remove about half of the excitatory connections in our prefrontal cortex. So we have twice as many when we're 12 as when we're 16. And the reason that that's done is that in many different systems during brain development, many systems, they could be the um, fibers going to your toe for sensory, for feeling, and they could be for many different types of senses. Connections from your eye to your brain. So in many different systems, instead of trying to make the wire connection perfect on the first time, the way you would when you're, say, building a telephone network, you're going to connect one person to another, you actually put the wires one to one. In the way the brain develops is it makes a lot of extra connections, and then it throws out the ones that aren't as useful. And that allows environments to sculpt how we think, which is very adaptive, especially for mammals. Basically all mammals do that, and all mammals learn. Whether they're a hunter, they learn. A cheetah learns from its parents how to hunt, and so if you're going to need learning behavior in order to survive, it's beneficial to make more connections than you're going to need, and then sculpt those connections through experience and keep the ones that are good and toss the ones that are not necessary. And that way, in the end, you end up with a circuit that's more efficient. It's been trained by experience rather than just have everything pre-wired. And so in humans and in primates, we do a lot of pruning or removing of excitatory connections in the frontal cortex when we're early in adolescence, early in puberty. And people with schizophrenia seem to end up with too few of these connections. It's not clear in any individual whether some individuals probably, they cut too many. They start with a normal number and then they remove too many. Other individuals probably don't start with the right amount. They start with too few. And then when they remove a bunch, now they have so little that the system doesn't work right. Other individuals, and this is where it gets kind of complicated, might not have a problem with the excitatory cells at all. They could have a problem with the inhibitory cells. So some of the inhibitory cells are kind of like the conductor in an orchestra. They'll inhibit a whole bunch of the excitatory cells at the same time by their activity. And then when they stop firing, all those excitatory cells fire together. And when they fire together, they stimulate the inhibitory cell, which then will stop the excitatory cells for a little while. And then again, when the inhibitory cell stops firing, the excitatory cells fire together. So this creates an oscillation. And these oscillations are really critical to the way we think. It seems that our thinking isn't so much about how one neuron fires, it's how these ensembles fire together in an oscillation, in a rhythmic firing of millions of cells. And these inhibitory interneurons control those oscillations. So if the inhibitory cells aren't working right, the excitatory cells might fire, but they're not firing rhythmically. So the net effect is similar to if they're not connected right. Because if they're not connected right, okay, the message doesn't get through, but the message isn't going to get through if they are connected, but they're not firing rhythmically, because then it's just a bunch of noise. So you could have what you consider a disconnectivity, could be a failure of the inhibition to synchronize the activity, or could be a failure of just the way the connections happen, the synapses happen in the first place. Or it could be because they over prune. So I hope that kind of makes sense. But there's several different ways that the brain of the person with schizophrenia seems to have less connection, ultimately less excitatory connection in the prefrontal cortex than the person that doesn't have schizophrenia.
And does this also are there other things related in the brain that could occur or could not occur? Because if a person with, let's say, schizophrenia, if there is, let's say, like differences in cortical volume, like when we're looking through a brain scan perspective, right? Look, if there's like differences in gray matter or white matter, or I don't know, thalamic volume, is there any differences in those or similarities between a normal person?
Yeah, sure. And it sounds great. And it sounds like you've been doing some good reading. There's very good evidence that the brain changes in people with schizophrenia very early in the illness and maybe before symptoms start. But usually, of course, those kind of studies are done after symptoms start. And some of those studies were done really in the 1970s and 1980s. And I think Weinberg from the NIH, he was one of the first labs, because the National Institutes of Health can gather a lot of, get people to come in that's harder for any single university. And he did a really famous study where he studied identical twins in which one has schizophrenia and one does not have schizophrenia. And they really beautifully showed that the individual with schizophrenia has bigger ventricles, the space within the brain that has fluid that flushes through it. It's sort of part of, you could kind of grossly consider it the kind of the sewer system of the brain. It takes out some of the toxins and things that cells emit and helps rinse them out. And so they're larger and their brain volume is smaller. And other people, when magnetic resonance imaging became available, and have done a lot of studies on that since. And normally the gray matter of the brain gets a little thinner during puberty because of that synaptic pruning. Because it's not just the synapses that get pruned, it's the connections, the axons get pruned away also. And so the cortex gray matter gets a little bit thinner by about 10% during normal puberty. But people with schizophrenia, it seems to get thinner by a little more than normal, maybe 15%, a little extra. And they end up with a little bit less of those cells. The thalamus is interesting, and the thalamus has a lot of connections that go up to the neocortex in general and to the prefrontal cortex also. And so it's unclear if the thalamus gets smaller because there are less cells or there's lower activity in the cells that it's connecting to, or if maybe for some people, the thalamus is the source of the problem and the output from the thalamus is weak, and therefore it's exciting the cortex less than it should. And so that's not something that people have studied as much as focusing on the neocortex, but it's certainly something that's out there, that the thalamus could also be part of the problem. Or, it's always so hard with the illness, mental illness, and we can't just sort of biopsy the brain like we can other types of, like if someone has a liver problem, you can stick a needle in it and take out liver cells and study them. And we obviously won't do that with people with a brain disorder, at least like schizophrenia. So we have to make guesses about the chicken and the egg. If you see an abnormality, you don't know whether it's downstream of the illness or whether it's upstream or part of the illness. It might be even a compensation to the illness, and it might look like it's abnormal, but it's not abnormal because it's causing the illness. It's abnormal because it's the brain's attempt to compensate for the illness. And so figuring out all these things is hard, and it's what's made it so hard to really understand the neurobiology of illnesses like autism, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder.
I see. So you mentioned that there are different levels of symptoms within different groups of people. Do you think this is based on genetics?
Yeah, great question. Almost certainly, I think it's influenced by genetics. And there are now about 250 different, not genes, but gene locations in our entire genome that have variants that increase risk for schizophrenia. As you can imagine, since schizophrenia is in about 1% of people, and more or less the same throughout the planet, and it's a little higher in males and a little lower in females. But you can imagine if there's 250 variants increasing risk, each one of them increases risk like teeny a bit. There are a few different bigger mutations, one of which my lab studies quite a bit, called the 22q11 deletion syndrome, where the risk is much higher, and their risk, if you're missing these 46 genes on chromosome 22, the risk is closer to 25% for developing schizophrenia. but that variant is rare. So only about 1% of all people with schizophrenia have that deletion. When you get into the issue of, are there different genetic variants that are related to different symptoms? That's a great question. And it's clearly where I think a lot of people in psychiatric genetics are expecting us to be able to go. We are expecting to be able to think, if you have a certain combination of these risk variants, you're more likely to have one version of schizophrenia and maybe have one type of treatment that's more related to it. And someone else could have a different combination of variants leading to schizophrenia, and they might have a different treatment. And my lab is focusing on that specifically with genes related to mitochondria function. They're the energetics of cells. And we're trying to see whether we can make a case for identifying people that have a particular version of schizophrenia related to dysfunction of mitochondria that would have a specific treatment or prevention associated with it.
I see. So you mentioned like that there has to be like different treatments for different people, but do you think that there's ever going to be an outcome of one treatment, or is that not possible due to the various different symptoms of this disorder?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question, but I think that probably, yeah, it's well used that you choose the word disorder rather than disease. And it's more likely that we give it a name, but it's really several different diseases, that we give one name to. And we're going to need to have disease specific treatments. And when I use the word disease, I mean something where we really understand the pathology, like Alzheimer's or Huntington's, neither of which, by the way, we have treatments for really. But at least we understand quite a bit about what's causing the problem. We just don't know how to fix it. In the case of schizophrenia, we don't know what's causing the problem. And probably there are multiple things that can cause the problem. Probably there'll be a fair number of people that respond to the same treatment. And of course, there are the antipsychotic medications that that all target dopamine receptors, probably mostly in the striatum part of the brain. They seem to reduce, especially the hallucinations. They don't seem to do so well with those negative symptoms, like the working memory kind of problem. But if you can improve people's hallucinations, you can really improve their quality of life. So maybe there'll be other medications that can come along like that are maybe better than the dopamine receptor blockers, maybe have less side effects, but also help symptoms. But a true treatment that kind of makes somebody reasonably kind of the way they would have been if they hadn't been sick at all, I think this would have to be something that would be applied very early in the illness. You'd have to do that before the brain is done with this pruning phenomenon. You'd have to do this before they, finish puberty, finish adolescence, I'm guessing. Now, there are ways, though, in mice where there are mice that have symptoms related to schizophrenia, but it's not schizophrenia, it's a mouse or a rat. But they can have working memory deficits and other types of abnormalities that you also see in people with schizophrenia. And in some of these models, like in a 22q deletion model, so they have a model of missing most of the same genes that these people do that have this 25% risk of schizophrenia. These mice have some behaviors that are similar to people with schizophrenia, and including definitely working memory kinds of abnormalities. And you can fix them in the adult by rebalancing a specific circuit in their brain with basically gene therapy. And so you wouldn't, with that type of approach, if it's applied to humans, you wouldn't necessarily treat all the symptoms of schizophrenia, but you might be able to completely fix some of the symptoms. If it ever became ethical and appropriate to use this type of focal gene therapy. This involves injecting viruses into certain parts of the brain. Those viruses carry genetic constructs that allow certain cells to be either activated more or inactivated based on a medication you take by mouth. So it's a ways from being something that would be ethical to try in people, but it is working in rodents. That you can target a circuit, the circuit's too active, you can turn that specific circuit down, which is different from taking a medication, right? When you take a general medication, it goes to every part of your body and will have effects in many parts of the body. In this case, one uses a virus to transfer a gene into a specific cell type in the brain, in a specific location of the brain. And then you give them a medication, but that medication only will activate this artificial receptor that is put into those specific cells. And so it's much more specific. It won't have side effects. But of course, it'd be pretty scary to have someone say, hey, I want to put a virus carrying genes into your brain in order to rebalance a circuit. We're not ready to do that, yet. We're not sure it's safe, and that people would have to decide this is something that they want, and I'm not sure that they would.
So just to reiterate, it's just parts of the brain that are impaired or not working properly, not like there's some bacteria in their brain, or like, let's say, for the body that's affecting. Because if there was bacteria or virus, we can, I don't know, use a vaccine, right? We can create a vaccine from antibodies in the body, and through that we can build the immune and get rid of that somehow, and we'll be immune from it. But this is totally something else, and I think it's much more difficult because obviously with the various different symptoms, and also I think it's because of some parts of the brain that are impaired, getting to restart that at an adult age, I think might be much more harder than finding like vaccines, I believe.
Yeah, and I think if there were a way, I think once somebody has it, the solution to try to help people is going to be very different from people who are just in the process of getting it. It may be possible to prevent the development of schizophrenia, but the mechanism for doing that is probably very different from the process of treating it once it's already there.
I see.
Yeah.
So do you believe there are any misconceptions in your field of study?
Oh, sure. There's always misconceptions. I mean, people naturally, everybody harbors their distortions, whether they're scientists or anyone else, and we're all affected in the way we see the world, is affected by our experiences and our belief systems and things. And so surely there are misconceptions. There are still some people who think that if you believe in some certain thing, maybe some certain religion, if you believe hard enough in that religion, your voices will go away, and certainly I've seen people who get told, if you just believe, you'll be okay, and that's probably not going to help, most people. It can help people to say, hey, I understand I'm sick and I'm suffering in this way, but through religion, they can say, okay, maybe this is the way I was supposed to be or something, but it won't go away. I've seen people who actually benefit from religion in that sense, that they come to have some peace with their suffering, in the sense of, it doesn't really make them suffer less. The voices don't go away, but they try to contextualize those voices as part of a greater plan that makes them a little calmer about them. But I haven't seen, that when people try to use religion to cure people with something like schizophrenia, it's a little unfair, because it doesn't work, and that's a misconception. I feel like in general, at least within the American population, people have a pretty decent these days understanding and some level of respect for people with mental illnesses, and can understand, gee, I'm glad I'm not like that, and people try to understand. For example, people with schizophrenia, because they're hearing voices, if they're out and about, they often really like to blast headphones, because the headphones compete with the voices. Like I said, the auditory cortex is activated in people that are hearing hallucinations. So if you activate your auditory cortex by playing, heavy metal or something, or whatever it is, you don't hear the voices as much because your brain cells are busy, reacting to the real sound coming in. And so we see people like that on the train or the bus or whatever, and kind of give them space. And um, you know, I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel like the misconceptions aren't as bad as they were 50 years ago.
I see. Definitely. And my last question to you is, do you have any advice for the younger generation of who generally want to be in a similar field to yours?
Oh, sure. Well, advice. I don't know. I all I can say is I encourage people to follow their passions, and if they want to try to work on something like this, they need to understand it's going to be a long haul, and then they settle in, for the journey, and pace themselves accordingly. But I think it's wonderful if people have passion to try to work on this kind of challenges. And there's a lot of challenges to the world these days. I feel like in some ways there are more challenges. Even in the 70s, people were talking about global warming, but it's obviously a lot more acute now, 40 years later. And so, we face different types of challenges today. And whether schizophrenia itself is such a challenge relative to all the other challenges for someone who really wants to try to make a difference, I wouldn't want to say, but it depends
I
on their
see.
passion.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's it for all my questions. Do you have anything to add last minute or?
No, but really nice being interviewed by you. Great questions.
Thank you
Really
so
good.
much. I really appreciate your time. I had a great time talking to you. I mean, I learned a lot today. Yeah, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.